I know you're thinking of putting him up there, the Indian burial ground up that road. You're thinking if you bury his body there, it will come back to life. But sometimes dead is better. What comes out of the ground ain't the thing you put in. The Indians knew that. That's why they stopped using it when the ground went sour. Don't bury your son's body at the Indian burial ground, Starch. The one that's right up over there behind the Andersons' barn. Sometimes, dead is better.
It's a book so dark that when Stephen King considered it done, he put his draft in a drawer, telling himself that he'd finally gone too far. In his own words, he was horrified by what he'd penned, and to this day considers it to be the most frightening novel that he's ever written. The book is Pet Sematary, and before the ink was even dry on the page, its premise of pets and people returning from the dead had entered into popular culture. As Dean Winchester puts it in Supernatural.
What are you talking about? What's dead should stay dead. What? They're so nasty they rot the ground around them. I mean, come on, haven't you seen Pet Sematary?
Sure, it's a great joke, and anyone who's read the book or seen the films can appreciate the reference. But why does it resonate with us? So, join me now as we dig into the sour ground beyond the Little God Swamp and resurrect Pet Sematary, its dark side being much more familiar than you might think. Beyond the field were woods.
Why do you have a copy of The Shining in your freezer?
Everyone has their favourite Stephen King book. Perhaps you prefer it, The Shining, or Needful Things. With over 60 books to choose from, there's no shortage of choice. But with 3 films and a prequel television series, garnering it with more adaptations than any other Stephen King novel, Pet Sematary is a success story that continues to scare and to give as a concept. So have you ever wondered where Stephen King may have gotten his idea from? Any dedicated Stephen King fan will gladly tell you that the idea for the book came from some real-life experiences that the author had in the late 70s. In fact, Stephen King talks extensively about how he conceived of the book in his introduction to the 1989 edition of Pet Sematary. Many of the elements that you may be familiar with after reading it or watching the 1989 film are claimed by King to have actually occurred to him and his family around the time of writing the book. The scene in which Gage is flying the kite, the family's cat being run over on a busy road, and the neighbour across the street who warned him about the frequent trucks saying that roads used up a lot of animals, which in the film becomes,
"There's that damn road. Uses up a lot of animals."
And that's all fine and dandy, but that's just the field in which events are set. Whereas what we all want to know is what lives in the woods beyond. The obvious answer, and the one that surprises me that people don't seem to connect the dots to that often when talking about Pet Sematary,
The ground is sour!
is the novel Frankenstein by Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, which was first published in 1818. Both books tell the story of a doctor and deal with the reanimation of a corpse, along with the negative impact that this has on the protagonist. Both novels feature a character called Victor Frankenstein, the creator of the monster, and Victor Pascal, who acts as a spirit guide to Louis and Rachel. And then in the 1989 film, there's Fred Gwynne, who plays the character of Judd Crandall. If you were wondering where you'd seen him before but couldn't quite spot it, Fred also played Herman Munster, aka Frankenstein's monster, in the Munsters television series. Which begs the question, was this a deliberate choice on the part of the film's director Mary Lambert, as has been the stated line, or did Stephen King have something to do with the hiring of Fred Gwynne for the part? If you know the answer to that, please add it in the comments, I'd love to know. And if you still weren't convinced by the connection, according to Professor Tony Magistral, who in the 2017 documentary Unearthed and Untold: The Path to Pet Sematary, says that at the time when King was writing Pet Sematary, he was also writer-in-residence at the University of Maine, Orono.
It's so nice to be here on another beautiful Maine day.
And the course that he was teaching was in 19th century British horror fiction. The three texts were Frankenstein, Jekyll and Hyde, and Dracula. Additional to this, I would add that Salem's Lot, published in 1975, clearly has its origins in Dracula. The Shining, published in 1977, has more than a hint of a Gothic haunting, as well as a loose connection to Jekyll and Hyde. Which leaves Frankenstein. Was it King's intention to complete his Gothic trilogy with Pet Sematary in 1979? Again, referring back to the documentary Unearthed and Untold, Stu Tinker, owner of SK Tours of Maine, claimed that the buying committee, at Doubleday the publishing house, didn't like it because it dealt with the death of a child, and it was a taboo subject back then. If this is indeed the case, then it's highly likely that it was indeed King's intention to complete the trilogy with this book. Instead, it was pushed back to 1983, when only after leaving Doubleday for Viking and still owing Doubleday a book, it was agreed upon that they could have Pet Sematary. It is old and always restless. Author H.P. Lovecraft once famously said, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." It wouldn't be a Stephen King novel if there wasn't some supernatural force at play, and in Pet Sematary, for this purpose, we have the Wendigo. This is the supernatural entity that is said to inhabit the Native American burial ground beyond the Pet Sematary. This is not a fictional being created by Stephen King, but a folkloric figure that features in the myths of several Native American tribes who share the Algonquin language. There's been a lot of interest in the Wendigo in recent years. In 2021, the film Antlers made use of it, as did the television series Hannibal, and after its pilot episode, it was the first monster featured in Supernatural. In general though, popular culture has leaned toward turning the Wendigo into a physical monster, whereas in Pet Sematary, it appears more as a driving supernatural force, which is more in keeping with the tradition. As Louis says in the book, the devil made them do it.
Fuck off, hairball.
Such is the case with the Wendigo. In the book, we learn about the Wendigo through the Native American Micmacs and the stories that they passed on to the local townfolk. If you've only seen the 1989 film though, you'll be scratching your head thinking, I don't remember anything about a Wendigo in the film. That's because even though the Wendigo is mentioned in the script written by Stephen King for the film, it doesn't make it into the final version that we see. It does return, however, in the 2019 version, albeit only as illustrations in a book. However, returning to the 1989 film, I take that back about not seeing the Wendigo. It's been there in plain sight all along, sitting on Judd's bedroom mantelpiece. Daddy, why do people have to be dead? Between Frankenstein and the Wendigo, however, both of which have appeared countless times in popular culture, we still don't really get to the crux of why Pet Sematary hits a disturbing nerve. So to answer that, I would turn to filmmaker George A. Romero. After teaching at the University of Maine in the late 70s, King pulled together his course notes and turned them into a book called Danse Macabre. In it, he refers to the work of Romero many times over, and in particular his 1968 film Night of the Living Dead, which he would appear to have a lot of respect for. In fact, King wanted Romero to direct the film version of Pet Sematary, but work commitments meant that he couldn't. So instead, the studio got Mary Lambert, whose previous directorial efforts included Madonna's Like a Virgin and Material Girl music videos. When you work out the connection there, let me know. Anyway, once you know this about King's interest in the work of Romero, and if you're familiar with Night of the Living Dead, you have to ask yourself, was Stephen King thinking of the child zombie scene in Night of the Living Dead when writing his scene where Louis fights for his life against his zombie-like son Gage? It's a scary scene, and as such, the visual horror of a weapon-wielding child has been used to great effect in films regularly ever since. Just think Chucky or Annabelle. This is why the Wendigo isn't needed in the film to make for scares. A hint of it is all that's required. The big chill comes from the idea of loved ones returning with evil intent. This is perhaps why Pet Sematary scared him so much. In writing it, he turned his abilities on himself, imagining what if his own child had died and returned with a bloodlust. As he himself said, he felt that he'd finally gone too far. But that's not forgetting the pet aspect, of course. It is the title of the book after all. Equally scary is the notion of animals coming back to life with a dark desire for human flesh. though we've seen this idea used in films many times over, ever since, in everything from Resident Evil to Zombie Beavers. And not forgetting I Am Legend, which is based on the 1954 book of the same name by Richard Matheson that kicked off the whole zombie horror genre. That's the Stephen King what if moment that he so best excels at. What if your dog were bitten by a rabies-infected bat? Or what if a car is possessed by evil forces? He can take a simple premise and show you its dark side, just as he did in Salem's Lot, in taking the Dracula story further, and in The Shining by pushing the boundaries of the gothic ghost story. In Pet Sematary, he's made Frankenstein more personal, just as Romero did with his zombie films and The Walking Dead has been doing for the last decade. It's the same principle at work, and it's an idea that just keeps on coming back to take hold of us. When King wrote Pet Sematary, though, it was a fresh idea. And I don't know about you, with Pet Sematary, I haven't been able to look at cats in a darkened room or children holding sharp objects the same way ever since.